Today is Friday, 3rd November 2023, the last day of the fifth month of Ukraine's counteroffensive. I say Ukraine's counteroffensive, though General Zaluzhny, the overall commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, all but admitted in his various articles, interviews, interactions with The Economist the other day, that offensive, that counteroffensive, has failed. However, it should be said that there's been no formal announcement to that effect by the Ukrainian government, but as I recall, the Ukrainian government also failed to announce that the offensive had actually begun when it did begin on the 4th of June. And it took several days, as I also remember, before the Western media finally acknowledged the fact that Ukraine had in fact launched its offensive. It took about a week after the offensive began on the 4th of June before the Western media began to report this. And I should say that there was an article in The Guardian this morning, which I will come to later, which continued to talk about the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, as if it was still underway, though when you drill into the details of the article, you quickly discover otherwise. But anyway, let us put all that to one side and return to that other great conflict, the one in the Middle East, the one which is dominating the headlines and which, it should be said immediately, is attracting more interest and concern around the world for the time being than the Ukrainian crisis is doing. Ukraine's crisis, which in my opinion is as geopolitically important as the crisis in the Middle East, is for most people around the world last year's story. The crisis in the Middle East in Gaza is today's story. And it affects far more immediately people in the Arab world, the wider Muslim world, people in the global south. And that is why we see such intense diplomatic and political activity around it. And it is to that I will come. But before I do, let me say a few things about the situation on the ground in Gaza. Now, yesterday, the Israeli military announced that they had fully surrounded Gaza City. And Hamas, by the way, confirmed that. Hamas acknowledged that Gaza is fully surrounded now by the Israeli military. They have surrounded it at least on 3 sides. And to all intents and purposes, they control all of the major exits from Gaza. Now, this is presumably, from a military perspective, important news. I say that I'm not a military person, but I must assume that when the Israelis say that they have surrounded Gaza, when Hamas confirms that they have surrounded Gaza, it's clear that what they're talking about is that they've surrounded the built-up areas of Gaza City, and presumably the fact that Hamas fighters are no longer able to move within the Gaza Strip. The non-built-up areas must restrict their movement in some form. It also, no doubt, makes impossible, or at the least very difficult, things that Hamas fighters have done previously, like go to the coast, take boats into the sea, use the sea to try to infiltrate into Israel. I'm assuming that this is now impossible, and I'm assuming also that use of hang gliders also to infiltrate into Israeli territory, that has also now become impossible. However, and I also feel I must say this, I can imagine, and again I repeat, I'm not an expert, that the surrounding of Gaza City in this manner does have significant military importance, but It is also important to remember that Gaza City, the Gaza Strip, has, to all intents and purposes, been surrounded by Israel all along. The Israelis control the crossing points into Gaza City from Egypt. There are Israeli troops there. The Israeli Navy is, of course, patrolling the coast of Gaza City and has been doing so for a very, very long time. And of course, Hamas has no air force to speak of, and the Israelis have, Israel has a very powerful air force and lots of sophisticated drones, and they've presumably closed the airspace as well. So I accept, in fact, I have no doubt at all, that the fact that Gaza City does have, has been surrounded, does have military significance. It will affect and reduce Hamas's movements to a great degree. I don't think it changes the picture fundamentally. What might do so is another military development, which I've also seen, and this is now I'm relying very much on maps, the complete accuracy of which I cannot vouch for. They are compilations by various bloggers and commentators and newspaper journalists. I don't think they are the products of militaries either. But they do seem to be, again, corroborated, at least to some extent, by reports, which, interestingly enough, Hamas itself is circulating, which shows a thrust by Israeli forces towards the sea, splitting Gaza in two. And I suspect that in terms of restricting and interfering with Hamas's movements, that operation, if it succeeds, which I assume it will, if the Israelis do manage to battle through to the sea, thereby separating Gaza into two distinct areas and pockets, I suspect that that will be of more decisive significance than this other announcement that Gaza itself has been surrounded. And it fully corresponds with the information I've been given by various military sources, the various military people who have been contacting me, who have been saying that the objective, the Israeli objective, will be to divide Gaza into pockets, to clear out one pocket of Hamas fighters at a time, to do this methodically and systematically over weeks and months, and eventually that is how Israel hopes and intends to achieve victory. So I think that is consistent, very consistent, with the information that I have been given by these military people. It corresponds exactly with what they envisaged Israeli military operations would look like. Now, there have to, again to be some qualifications to this. I expect that the Israelis will garrison this corridor through Gaza that they are creating. I'm not sure to what extent this is a built-up area, but I presume that they will do that. Nonetheless, this will be, presumably, at least in some parts, a heavily built-up area. It might be difficult to prevent movement from one part of Gaza to the other entirely. And of course, and this is again particularly speculative, if there is indeed this elaborate tunnel network under Gaza that many people are talking about, then perhaps, just possibly, Hamas has means to move men and supplies from one end of Gaza to the other, beneath where the Israeli soldiers are operating through this tunnel network. Now, I say all of that. Of course, it's also perhaps true that the Israelis might be able to use some kind of ground censoring equipment. I'm not a technical person, and might be able to get some sense of where these tunnels are and all that kind of thing. but I suspect that doing that will be technically challenging. I want to stress again, I'm not a military person, I'm not a technical person. I myself am trying to understand what is going on. Now, these reports that I have been discussing, which have been very well informed, very well explained. They've explained the military tactics from the Israeli perspective. Now, I'm not going to hide anything by saying that the military officers who have, or rather ex-military people who have been providing this information have served in Western militaries. I have seen quite a lot of commentary from Russian military people as well, but that has been open source. And by the way, it tends to mirror that the Western military people who have been writing to me have been saying. But anyway, these are predominantly Westerners who have been explaining the situation, the military situation for me. I have today received a very interesting Indian perspective about what is going on, and it's all I'm going to say. It's a person from India. I'm not going to disclose anything more about him than that's all I'm going to say about this person. But anyway, he has given a somewhat different perspective on it. He's pointed out that one of the problems that Western militaries have is that they are not really trained very heavily for this kind of war. The United States has experience of urban fighting in places like Fallujah and Mosul and Raqqa in the Middle East, recent experiences of this. The Russians, of course, have far more of it in Bakhmut and Mariupol and Soledar and Marinka and those places. But this person points out that in fighting an organization like Hamas, which, by the way, claims to have far more fighters at its disposal than, say, ISIS did in Mosul or Fallujah or Raqqa. Well, anyway, in fighting an organization like Hamas, which has had ample time to prepare for an operation like this, Western militaries are not particularly well trained or well organized to fight them. And this person gives a very interesting account of how Hamas might respond to these operations. And again, it's perhaps not my place to comment or discuss this, but basically he talks about what might be described as ambush operations carried out by small groups of Hamas fighters emerging from tunnels, melting into the civilian population in Gaza, coming out of various built-up places, attacking Israeli forces when they become isolated from each other, as they increasingly will become as they move deeper into Gaza City. Hit and run ambush operations, if one will. And this person also says that from what he has seen of the Hamas fighters, they seem to be more proficient in this kind of fighting, much more proficient in this kind of fighting than we have seen other militias show in the Middle East, and they seem to be better equipped to carry out these kind of operations. They have quite effective anti-tank equipment, quite effective weapon systems. They seem to have a functioning and reliable command and control system, and a resilient one. And they're also able to operate drones to an extent that, for example, ISIS and others also did, failed to do rather. They didn't have drone surveillance to the extent that Hamas does. And that means that they can also monitor much more effectively what the Israelis are doing than has been the case with other Islamist militias whom the Americans have fought before. And this person is of the view that the fighting is only now really starting. At least that's how I understand his commentary, that we've still got a long way to go, and that these have been predictable preliminary moves. We've seen predictable preliminary moves from each side, but that the battle is only now starting to shape out. Now, again, let me stress, I don't have remotely the kind of qualifications needed to be able to comment on this. And I hope, by the way, that I'm discussing and describing what I have read correctly and accurately. If I am not, I apologize, and I will obviously make corrections in future. What I will say is this: whatever commentary you take, whatever view of this fighting you take, let's assume that things proceed very much on the lines that it's of the strategy the Israelis appear to be following, which is basically to cut Gaza into isolated pockets, to clear through each pocket one by one, to track down the Gaza fighters, the Hamas fighters. Apparently the Israeli military, the IDF, has ruled out any idea of their fighters, of Israeli soldiers, going down into the labyrinth of tunnels that Hamas is presumed to have built. So the idea is to demolish, to blast, to try and find the exits to these tunnels, to destroy these exits, to seal the Hamas fighters in their tunnels, where what would await them in that case would be a grisly fate. But anyway, let's assume that this is the operation that is conducted and that it proceeds successfully. Again, that looks to me like a very protracted operation indeed, one that is going to last weeks, most probably months, most probably many months. And one other person who also writes to me, who I understand does not have a military background, this person has provided me a link to a commentary by an American officer. This is an open commentary, public commentary. And this American officer, who seems to be fairly aware of the nature of the Israeli operation, he believes that in order to be properly worked through, this Israeli plan would take about a year. So, a year of fighting, perhaps not as much as that, maybe months, maybe weeks of fighting, clearing pockets, sealing in, tracking down entrances to tunnels, repelling ambushes by Hamas fighters. A week, weeks, months, perhaps a year of fighting. To do that, Israeli troops, of course, taking casualties in the meantime, and we've seen some Israeli tanks and infantry fighting vehicles already damaged and destroyed. And we're now getting reports of quite senior Israeli military officers. I think I saw a report that at least one officer of lieutenant colonel rank, for example, has been killed which is, quite a senior officer indeed. Anyway, losses of Israeli senior officers. I saw that Haaretz, for example, said that another 5, the Israeli Defense Forces have confirmed the death of 5 more Israeli soldiers in the fighting. So increasing losses by those Israeli soldiers. But the most important point is, putting aside the level of losses the Israelis will face fighting in this way, clearing out Gaza one pocket at a time, repelling whatever ambushes Hamas launches. Anyway, putting all that aside, the important thing to remember is that all of these pockets will be in a densely inhabited city. And a densely inhabited city in which there is no water, or at least no secure water supplies, no secure food supplies, no secure energy supplies, and where aerial bombing will continue relentlessly, as it is doing now. Now, this is a prescription for a humanitarian catastrophe of a scale, well, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations spoke about it being on a biblical scale. I'm not going to try and cap that adjective, but a humanitarian catastrophe on an absolutely massive scale. And I come back to what I have already said. I don't think that this is politically achievable. Certainly not if it goes on for weeks or months, and absolutely not if it is expected to continue for a whole year. Now, yesterday I discussed in detail that there is already a potential legal case, including a potential legal case on genocide charges against senior officials of the Israeli government, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. To be very clear, I'm not saying that case will be brought. There has to be a referral to the International Criminal Court, or if there's not, well, conceivably they could do what they did in the case they brought against President Putin of Russia. They might decide, despite the fact that Israel is not signed up to the Rome Statute, and despite the fact that there's been no UN referral to them, either from the Security Council or the General Assembly, to bring a prosecution. Well, I have to say, I think that for the moment is perhaps less likely, but the possibility for that exists. The possibility of a referral, for example, by the General Assembly, I would have said is a strong one. And if a referral from the General Assembly does indeed come, then I think that the International Criminal Court will be under overwhelming political pressure to start an investigation. And given the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu and some of his officials have said, and given the way in which this military operation in Gaza is being played out, the bombing, the clearing of one particular location after another, all of that with all these other reports now pretty much confirmed that the Israelis were planning or were looking to negotiate with Egypt and other Arab countries what looks like the displacement of the entire population of Gaza. Well, given that that is so, if a serious investigation begins following a referral to the ICC from the United Nations General Assembly, for example, then I personally find it very difficult to see how some kind of charges, some kind of indictment, some kind of arrest warrant might not be issued. And of course, that would be a major diplomatic embarrassment, not just for Israel itself, but for the Western powers. What would they do in that case? After all, they've built up the ICC. They have supported the ICC's, frankly, unfounded and legally dubious investigation of President Putin and the indictment it has issued against him. How do they simply turn round then and say that a similar case brought by the ICC against Israeli officials, well, that really shouldn't proceed, that the ICC has become some kind of politicized court? No doubt they will say those things, or they will try to say those things, but it will reinforce the already universal perception that the West follows one set of rules for those it supports and a completely different set of rules for those it opposes, and that its claims to be operating a rules-based system is nothing more than a sham, which is, of course, what the Chinese and the Russians have been arguing all along. And can I repeat again, I think we're coming closer to that point all the time when something like this is likely to happen. And if an operation of the kind that I've just been talking about is indeed conducted over those weeks and months, then I don't see how it can be avoided with all the enormous consequences that it might have, with all the huge consequences it will have in the United States, which might very well, in that case, start to reconsider its previous involvement with the International Criminal Court, doesn't accept the Rome Statute. It's insisted that it will not allow its own people to face charges in the International Criminal Court. But if the International Criminal Court were to start issuing arrest warrants against Israeli officials, then I think the United States and some of the countries of the West in the European Union would perhaps feel that they have not only to distance themselves from the court, but perhaps even to take action to either refashion it or even to close it down. So, the stakes are becoming extremely high. So, this is a difficult operation for Israel to conduct. And I would have said over a prolonged period of time, an impossible one. And that is looking at this in an incredibly cold-blooded and unemotional way, which, of course, most people around the world are not doing. They will be looking at all those pictures of all those people dying in Gaza, and they will be pushing back, and they will be increasingly vociferous in complaining about this. Now, I think that there are, as I said in my video yesterday, officials in the United States who understand that. Now, yesterday, President Biden blurted out a comment in response to a heckler that he wanted to see a humanitarian pause. Not a ceasefire, mind you, but a humanitarian pause. And he's already coming under criticism from some people in the United States who want to see this operation by Israel seen through. They're already criticizing him for it. I noticed that National Review, William Buckley's magazine, the late William Buckley's magazine, which takes a very strong line supporting Israel against Hamas. Anyway, they've already said that they've already published an article which says that President Biden is buckling under the pressure. So we see the political pressures that he's coming under. President Biden is now coming under from both sides. Now, I did wonder in my program yesterday whether President Biden might have just blurted this comment out in response to a heckler, that it might not have been thought through. But now we can see that President Biden did mean what he said. His Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has been sent to Israel, and he's apparently there now already. And all the talk is that he's now going to start pressing Israel to agree to a humanitarian pause, not a ceasefire. And this looks like it's going to be a temporary pause, a temporary cessation of the fighting. This is what the White House thinks. They wanted fighting to stop for perhaps a day, 2 days, 3 days, 5, 10, who knows. And the idea is to allow relief supplies to enter Gaza to try to help the situation there. But of course, they won't make any material difference to the situation there. These kind of humanitarian pauses are not really going to change the situation. I suspect that the United States, knowing this, will again try to get the Arab states to agree to take at least refugees from Gaza. And there is again an article today in the Daily Telegraph by Sir Ivor Roberts, former British diplomat, who has been posted to the Middle East, and he is expressing frustration, anger in this article about the fact that the Arab states are absolutely categorically refusing to accept refugees from Gaza. They are, of course, saying that they will not accept those refugees because they don't want to open the door for displacement of the population of Gaza. It's, in effect, expulsion from Gaza. And I noticed that Sir Ivor Roberts doesn't really dwell on that last fact. But I can imagine that the United States will make a renewed effort to try to persuade the Arab states to accept refugees from Gaza. But I suspect that the Arab states will again adamantly refuse, and they will instead reiterate their demand not just for a humanitarian pause, but for an outright ceasefire, an indefinite ceasefire. And of course, the Israeli government is adamantly opposed to this. I understand that officials in the Pentagon are also unhappy about the idea. They've been instructed to support a military operation in Gaza. They will not be happy to be told that they've deployed all those people to Israel, they've provided all that advice, they've provided all that equipment, and that the entire operation has been brought to a stop almost before it has properly begun. So we are looking inevitably at further clashes. Now, yesterday I talked about the cascade of countries in Latin America, which have started to reduce or sever relations with Israel. Bolivia has broken off diplomatic relations with Israel entirely. Chile and Colombia have recalled their ambassadors. I've since learnt that Bahrain is now doing the same thing. This is another Arab country following on Jordan, which has done the same thing. There's been a vote, a unanimous vote in the Algerian parliament, authorizing the president of Algeria to declare war on Israel if he considers it proper to do so. Well, that's not happening, and of course it's to some extent an example of posturing from the Algerian parliament, but again, it probably reflects the very strong feelings about this conflict that do exist in Algeria. But what I do expect is going to happen is that there's going to be more and more demands for a ceasefire. And powerful governments around the world, Brazil, for example, are not only now weighing in, demanding a ceasefire, but the Brazilian government is now openly talking about war crimes committed by Israel. And of course, Brazil has already submitted a resolution to the Security Council calling for a ceasefire, a resolution which condemned the terrorism carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October, but which called for a ceasefire. And the Brazilian government is now also talking about war crimes and about collective punishment as well. And Argentina apparently is also becoming increasingly critical. So are other countries. I mentioned previously, a couple of programs ago, how the ASEAN states have now issued a statement that basically calls essentially for a ceasefire and for the establishment of a Palestinian state and a renewal of negotiations to achieve that. There's now word that the Prime Minister of Malaysia, which is a predominantly Muslim country, a Muslim country, by the way, which I have visited. I have personally been to Malaysia. I have been to Kuala Lumpur, and it's fair to say that the form in which Islam is practiced in Malaysia is more liberal than you might find in certain other places in the world, more liberal than what you would find in Saudi Arabia, for example. Nonetheless, amongst those who do practice Islam in Malaysia, they take it seriously. And of course, they are very concerned about what is happening in Israel and in Gaza and elsewhere in the Palestinian territories. And of course, about what might happen in Jerusalem, in the Haram al-Sharif and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the Prime Minister of Malaysia is apparently now saying that Malaysia might decide to boycott the APEC, the Asia-Pacific Summit that the United States is intending to convene shortly in San Francisco, the one to which the United States is trying to persuade Xi Jinping, the president of China, to come. And more about that soon. Well, apparently the Prime Minister of Malaysia has indicated that he is, for the moment, intending not to go. There are other states in Southeast Asia, Brunei, for example, which are Muslim and which also might decide not to go as well. And one way or the other, we can see that the diplomatic pressure is building and it will continue to build. And I understand again the deep frustration that some people in Israel feel that the events of 7th of October, the violence against Israeli civilians that took place there as a result of the Hamas attack, they're becoming increasingly frustrated that that is becoming forgotten and disregarded by many people around the world. I'm not sure to what extent it is disregarded, but certainly it is receding, and it is unsurprising that this is so, because those events are now more than 3 weeks old, whereas the events in Gaza itself, the bombing of Gaza, the fighting in Gaza, the deaths and killings in Gaza, the deprivation of food and water and energy supplies to Gaza, those are happening now in real time. And inevitably, people are focusing on those, and increasingly so, and the fact that the scale of these deaths and of these miseries in Gaza are on of such enormous scope and are continuing all the time means that most people around the world are now increasingly focused on those and want to bring them to a stop and feel an urgent need to do so. Now, I mentioned Xi Jinping and the Chinese government and this tantalizing invitation that has been extended by the United States for him to come to the APEC summit in San Francisco. And it seemed a couple of days ago that after Wang Yi's visit to Washington, that visit to the APEC summit was indeed going to happen. And it seemed also that a summit meeting there between Xi Jinping and President Biden might actually take place. But Wang Yi subsequently poured some cold water over that. He said that there was still an enormous amount of work to do. And there are reports that the Chinese government has still not made a final decision. Apparently, one of the complications, and I should thank Sofia Mitke for this information, was that the United States failed to extend an invitation to the chief executive of Hong Kong. Apparently, the Chinese made it absolutely clear that unless an invitation to the chief executive of Hong Kong to attend the summit was issued, then there was absolutely no chance of Xi Jinping going to San Francisco. The United States apparently has now extended an invitation to the chief executive of Hong Kong. It's not at all clear that this person is indeed going to go to the APEC summit. And it's still up in the air whether Xi Jinping is really intending to go there or not. But what Xi Jinping is doing is that he is now himself directly engaging in diplomatic activity. And he has been on the phone to the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. It's not clear to me who initiated the call. And interestingly enough, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has not provided an English language readout of the discussion between Xi Jinping and Olaf Scholz. It's likely that they talked about economic cooperation between China and Germany. It's likely also that they discussed the conflict in Ukraine. But, as has been pointed out to me by, amongst others, Sofia Mitke, who is, of course, the person who alerted me to the fact that this conversation had taken place, China is due shortly to assume the presidency of the UN Security Council, and China is now working very hard to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. Not just a humanitarian pause, but a proper, actual ceasefire. And with China holding the presidency of the Security Council, they will be in a very, very strong position to work towards that objective. They'll be able to convene meetings. They will be able to invite representatives, not just of humanitarian agencies, but also perhaps representatives of people in Gaza itself. They might arrange also for leaders of Arab states to address the Security Council. That also will be a means to make the pressure grow. And other things might also be working towards that end. Now, the head of Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia group, which has had conflicts with Israel in the past, and which is organized on a much greater scale than Hamas is, and has a far more powerful armory than Hamas does, and which is straightforwardly backed by Iran. Anyway, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, is apparently due to speak. He's due to make a public address about the conflict in Gaza. And interestingly, this is the first time he has apparently spoken publicly in this way about this conflict ever since it began on the 7th of October. Now, we're all waiting to see what he's going to say. He hasn't yet spoken, at least not as of the time of the making of this program. But it's not impossible that he's going to draw red lines. He's going to start saying that if Israel oversteps in some ways in Gaza, then Hezbollah, which must be under great internal pressure from its own supporters and some of its own fighters to intervene in this conflict, that Hezbollah will have to take action. And of course, that will complicate the situation further. And given that behind Hezbollah is Iran, it will reopen the spectre, the possible spectre of an increased, enlarged war. One which might draw in Iran after all. One which, given that this vast concentration of US forces in the Middle East remains there, all these carrier groups, all these missiles, all these fighter jets, all of these forces remain in the Middle East, despite the more conciliatory words from the administration that they're not going to seek a wider war. Of course, if Hezbollah does become involved, if it launches attacks on northern Israel, then Israel might feel that it has no option than to strike back at Hezbollah. In fact, it would undoubtedly do so. That could cause the whole situation to spiral. And it's easy to see how first Iran might become involved, and then Israel and Iran might be in conflict with each other, and then the United States itself might feel that it has no option but to intervene, in which case we are in a massively escalating situation. So the pressure is on, and I suspect that, as I said in my previous program, we're going to see more demands for a ceasefire coming from the General Assembly, within the United Nations, within the Security Council, coming from around the world within the next few days. I understand that the US government is already concerned that Malaysia, a country with which the United States has worked hard to establish good relations, if only in order to try to draw Malaysia away from China, that Malaysia is apparently so agitated, so angry about what is happening, that its Prime Minister is now thinking of boycotting the APEC summit. So, humanitarian pause may be what the United States is thinking about at the present time. It might be what Secretary of State Blinken is bringing with him, the idea of it is what he's bringing with him to Israel. But the possibility, in fact the certainty, is that even if Israel were to agree to such a humanitarian pause, there would be immediate demands, including demands in the Security Council, for that humanitarian pause to be converted into an outright ceasefire, and far from the humanitarian pause reducing the pressure on the Biden administration, as they perhaps hope, it might increase it instead. So there we are. Anyway, we shall see how things turn out. In the meantime, I would say that I've noticed that more and more articles are appearing in all sorts of places now, in the American and British media, which to me, clearly signal the fact that the administration, the Biden administration, the US government, not just the administration, but the totality of the US government and that of Britain, want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu go. They want to see the back of him. They feel that, to a great extent, he is the person who has landed them in this crisis. And they also see him as an obstacle to possible diplomatic moves to try to extricate the Western powers from the mess that they're in. So we've had an article, a huge article in the Financial Times, which says that Bibi's finished, Benjamin Netanyahu loses core support after Hamas assault on Israel. And it then goes on to say, in stronghold of Prime Minister's Likud party, Israelis vent anger at refusal to shoulder blame for attacks. And it's been suggested that even Prime Minister Netanyahu's base, his electoral base, is now turning on him. By the way, I ought to say that the article itself, when you read it through, doesn't quite say that. It involves a visit by Financial Times journalists to a market in an area where most of the people reliably vote for Likud. And it is indeed the case that they found some people there who are highly critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu and want to see him go. But they also found a fact not reflected in this title: some people who continue to support Prime Minister Netanyahu and who want him to stay. But anyway, that is the article in the Financial Times. There's also other articles in other places. And there's an article, for example, in Foreign Policy, one of the big three of American journals that deals with foreign policy. Foreign Policy, and it's by a person, Mr. Daniel C. Kurtzer, and it says, I worked with Netanyahu. It's time for him to step down. And we're told that Mr. Kurtzer is a former US ambassador to Israel, and he says that Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his mandate and the confidence of Israel's closest allies. Of course, the key ally there is the United States. So there is every sign to me, all the signs are there, that there is a gathering consensus in Washington and London that Prime Minister Netanyahu must go. We must remove him from the scene. His presence is complicating matters, making it very difficult to hold things together in the UN, perhaps agree proper humanitarian pauses, or indeed ceasefires if it comes to that. And one way or the other, Prime Minister Netanyahu must go. And as I've said already, I don't think it is getting him removed is going to be that easy. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as that Financial Times article actually showed, does retain some support in Israel. And of course, he also has political supporters in the United States as well. And he shows no sign of wanting to leave. And as I said, I think it's going to be particularly difficult to get him to go. By the way, the Foreign Policy also has other articles about the crisis, about how there is now a storm of dissent brewing in the State Department, about how US diplomats are split over Biden's perceived blank check support for Israel. And there's a long piece about how large parts of the US's own diplomatic corps are now in virtually open rebellion about what is going on, and that inevitably is going to weigh on the pressure as well. So, coming back to what I said, Israel has this policy of wanting to destroy Hamas. There is overwhelming public support in Israel for this policy of destroying Hamas. I've seen opinion polls come out of Israel which, unsurprisingly, given the events of the 7th of October, show that that is what most Israeli people want to see. But, as I've said already, the longer this conflict continues, the longer the fighting continues, the greater the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and all the indications are that it is going to get worse and worse as this fighting continues. As I said, Israel's battle plan involves street fighting in a densely populated city of 2.3 million people, which is being cut off from food and water and energy, with talk of sending in some supplies, but that's hardly going to help in this kind of situation. Anyway, all of that, sooner or later, something will crack, and we won't just get a humanitarian ceasefire. We're going to get a humanitarian pause. We're going to get a ceasefire as well. And I personally believe that the United States will not wait until there is a vote demanding it from the General Assembly, perhaps under the Uniting for Peace formula. I think that it will happen when the United States finally comes to see that the pressure is becoming overwhelming and that it has no choice but to agree to this. This is, as I said in my program yesterday, a diplomatic debacle. What the United States needs to do is to get ahead of this crisis in its own interests, telling the Americans, the American government, what its own interests are. It needs to get ahead. It needs to propose some kind of a ceasefire itself and propose some kind of diplomatic initiative to resolve the whole problem with Palestine. Israel, in its own interests, need to do the same. Once they've done all of those things, and once the anger has subsided, and that may take a while to happen, I think that then perhaps they can go back to the Security Council and start to see whether they can use the UN machinery to prescribe Hamas and do all of those other things which I've discussed about Hamas in previous programs. Much more difficult to do now, and of course, if there is a ceasefire, Hamas will claim that it is the victor, and there will be many people in the Arab world who might agree, in which case putting together the political support to take legal action against Hamas is going to be extremely difficult indeed. But that is the result of the mistakes which have already been made. Anyway, we shall see what happens. We will see what Mr. Blinken achieves whilst he's in Israel, whether the Americans do get their humanitarian pause. I'm going to make a guess. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who understands the situation fairly well, understands how potentially dangerous for him a humanitarian pause is. He probably understands that if there is any kind of pause at all, pressure for an outright ceasefire is likely to grow rather than reduce. And I suspect he's going to try to push back against even that idea. And of course, he is fully aware of all of these attempts by people in Washington and London to try to remove him from the scene. And that's going to make him even more suspicious of what Secretary Blinken is up to. And I suspect that these discussions between Blinken and Netanyahu, for all these reasons, are not going to be easy at all. So whilst I think that in the end, the influence of the United States in Israel will be strong enough to get a humanitarian pause, I doubt that will be quite as straightforward as some people imagine. Anyway, that is where we are for the moment in the situation in the Middle East. Now, let me come back to that other crisis, the one in Ukraine. As I've pointed out, we are now 5 months. We've now seen 5 months of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which even General Zaluzhny, the overall commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, the military commander-in-chief, is admitting, in effect, that it has been a failure. He talks about the war being in a state of stalemate, in a sense of impasse. There's been no breakthrough, no victory anywhere on any part of the lines. The Surovikin line has not been pierced or broken through, and everywhere along the front lines, the Russians now are advancing. Now, I want to just discuss briefly the situation on the ground. I noticed, if I come back to that article in The Guardian that I mentioned at the outset of this program, this article spoke about the offensive as still being, the Ukrainian offensive as still being underway, despite General Zaluzhny's admission that things are at a stalemate, that no breakthrough has taken place. By the way, I neglected to mention in my discussion of General Zaluzhny's discussions with The Economist yesterday that he actually gave away the timetable for Ukraine's offensive. It was supposed to have achieved its objective of reaching and isolating Crimea within 4 months. 4 months. And of course, 5 months after the start of the offensive, they haven't even managed to get beyond first base. But anyway, that's just an aside. So let's go back to what The Guardian is saying. They nonetheless pretend, despite what General Zaluzhny is saying, and despite what has happened, what is actually happening on the battlefronts in places like Kupiansk, Avdeyevka, Vuhledar, which we will get to shortly, they are still talking about a Ukrainian offensive. And of course, they've got to find somewhere where Ukraine is advancing. So they've hit upon the fact that there is a small group of Ukrainian Marines who've taken up occupying several buildings and houses in a village, Krinky, on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. However, I have to say, when I actually read the article through, it became immediately clear that despite the heroic attempts of some of the people in The Guardian to talk up this particular incursion, anyway, it became immediately clear that the experts, the military experts The Guardian is consulting, are more than dubious. They point out that the people who have occupied Krinky are infantry, that Ukraine has been unable to transfer tanks and armored vehicles to the East Bank. Doesn't seem for the moment that they're likely to do so. The Dnieper itself is wide. Of course, there are islands within it, but the soil is soft and marshy, as it inevitably is, near to a river. The Russians have belts of minefields and fortifications further east than Krinky. They're present with their artillery. Their air force is active. And from the description of this particular incursion in The Guardian, one got the sense that just about the only thing for the moment that the Ukrainians can do is cling on to these buildings in Krinky, and that to try to exploit this bridgehead, if that's what it is, will be extremely difficult indeed and will depend on an awful lot of good luck. Well, I'm going to say that I don't think that good luck is going to come. In fact, I think that Ukraine's good luck in terms of Krinky is probably going to run out fairly soon. There's been lots of explanations now from all sorts of people, confirmed, by the way, by this article in The Guardian, as to why the Ukrainians have been able to dig in at Krinky, even though there's perhaps no more than 100, some say even less than that, 30 men there. And the reason is that the right bank, the west bank of the Dnieper, which is the one that the Ukrainians control, is much higher than the east bank. That means that Ukrainian artillery and tanks are able to look down at Krinky, and that they're able to strike at any Russian troops that advance towards Krinky. So Ukrainian troops in Krinky have the protection of artillery, Ukrainian artillery, on the West Bank. But, of course, the Russians have their air force, they have their drones, they have their electronic systems, they have other means to counter this. There's now evidence that the Russians are launching intense bombing and drone strikes on those Ukrainian artillery positions on the West Bank. They have a new commander, General Teplinsky, whom I talked about before, who is one of the outstanding military commanders in this conflict, and he's just been placed in charge. And there were even reports yesterday, which I saw with Reba, that the Russians have actually now begun to move closer to Krinky, and that it's becoming more difficult for the Ukrainians there. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, because this is the only place where one can speak of the Ukrainians having any degree of initiative in their hands left. Everywhere else, the situation is getting worse. And what appears to be happening is that there is now a massive argument underway between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny about what to do with Avdeyevka. The Russians are steadily increasing their pressure on around Avdeyevka. Both the pincers, the one in the north and the one in the south, are gradually closing the funnel round Avdeyevka. Most of the fighting, most of the big advances are taking place in the north. The Russians appear to be gathering more forces close to the northern pincer, to Avdeyevka there. They're gathering more forces, which seem to be preparing for a further advance. There's some reports that they're going to try and capture the coke plant, which is next to the slag heap. And then once they capture the coke plant, well, the situation in Avdeyevka becomes irretrievable. There are other suggestions that their plan instead is to move further west to capture the villages of Stepnoye and Berdichi, which would also, in effect, close the funnel, or so it seems. At least that's what commentators that I've been reading are saying. Anyway, it seems that General Zaluzhny, as he regularly does, is advising President Zelensky that the situation in Avdeyevka is desperate, it is irretrievable, that losing more troops in Avdeyevka is a pointless sacrifice, and that the troops need to be evacuated from Avdeyevka, and Ukraine needs to reorganize and go on the defensive. And that is going to be, by the way, a very difficult thing to do, because Ukraine has not followed the advice of George Beebe and Jim Webb, given all the way back in August. They've not built, apparently, proper fortified lines to fall back on. But anyway, that seems to be what General Zaluzhny wants to do. President Zelensky, as is his continuous pattern throughout the war, wants to defend everywhere with everything. He refused to pull out of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. He refused before that to allow people in Mariupol to surrender. He fought ferociously and bitterly for Bakhmut. He insisted on this offensive that has now failed, and he does not want to give up Avdeyevka. And of course, he's coming up with political reasons, primarily, to do so. He apparently is telling General Zaluzhny, if we lose Avdeyevka, the West will decide that the war is indeed lost, and they're already showing signs of losing confidence and faith in us. The Republicans in the House of Representatives have now put forward a budget proposal which provides funding for Israel, but which provides no funding for Ukraine. The Republicans want funding for Ukraine to be considered as a standalone measure. And of course, and this is perhaps a point which ought to be made, given that General Zaluzhny, who is the overall military commander of the Ukrainian military, is now saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless there's some great new technological breakthrough, some new miracle weapons that can change the entire direction of the war, and unless Ukraine is provided with a vast cornucopia of weapons which would strain the American military arsenal to breaking point. Well, given that that is what General Zaluzhny is saying, that Ukraine is no longer in a position where it can realistically hope to win, why is President Biden proposing to give Ukraine another $61 billion? Based on what General Zaluzhny is saying, surely that is now definitely a case of throwing good money after bad. I wonder if before long someone within the Republican Party isn't going to notice that and isn't going to start making that very point. Anyway, President Zelensky is apparently saying to General Zaluzhny, we've got to hold on to Avdeyevka. We've got to hold on there, because if we don't, if Avdeyevka falls, the West will despair of us, and further funding and further support will end. And there's even, by the way, a report circulating which may come from a Ukrainian channel close to Zelensky, or is based on information that his people are providing, which apparently is saying that the Biden administration is telling Ukraine to hold on to Avdeyevka until this situation with Ukraine's funding is resolved and out of the way. I don't know, by the way, whether that is true. It might just be President Zelensky's people spreading that story in order to try to make sure that the Ukrainian defenders of Avdeyevka continue to defend it. Now, the consistent pattern of this war up to this time is that President Zelensky invariably gets his way. General Zaluzhny apparently complains and protests, but he always ends up doing whatever it is that President Zelensky asks him to do. He may have disapproved of the decision to hold on to Bakhmut, for example, but he went along with it. He went along with every demand, every command that President Zelensky has given him. And by the way, his recent attempts to exculpate himself, which is to my mind what all that interaction with The Economist was all about, is for me completely unconvincing in light of that fact. So I expect that President Zelensky will get his way, and the Ukrainians will continue to try to defend in Avdeyevka. And we're now hearing reports that General Tarnavsky, who is in command of Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye, is now redeploying more and more troops from the Zaporozhye front lines, where the great breakthrough to the Sea of Azov was supposed to take place. He's busy redeploying them north towards Avdeyevka, enabling the Russians to actually regain lost ground. There was even a report I read yesterday on Slavyangrad, which said that the Russians have now reoccupied or are in the process of reoccupying the ruins of the village of Pyatikhatki on the west bank of the Dnieper, the east bank of the Dnieper, north of Kherson region, where there'd been a lot of bitter fighting at the start of the offensive, that the Russians are gradually now pushing back the Ukrainians all along the front line. They're successfully pushing the Ukrainians back around Bakhmut, and they also seem to be busy carrying out a major envelopment of Ukrainian forces near Kupiansk. So, Ukraine, short of men, short of machines, and by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that something like 8 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed during one 24-hour period. From what I could judge in fighting in and around Avdeyevka, these will be Bradley infantry fighting vehicles belonging to the 47th Mechanized Division, a brigade which Ukraine has redeployed from the Zaporozhye front to try to hold positions in Avdeyevka. And I don't know that it was the full 8, but I have seen photographs which do show knocked out Bradleys in some of these villages. You can see a lot more of that on the Military Summary channel. Dima is very reliable about collating together all this photographic evidence. But anyway, all of these men and machines are being concentrated increasingly in the Avdeyevka area. Ukraine is short of reserves. They're being burnt up there. And we're starting to see an Avdeyevka meat grinder take over from the Bakhmut meat grinder of a few months ago. Except that I am starting to get the sense that events in Avdeyevka are moving faster than they did in Bakhmut. Now, I may turn out to be completely wrong about this, but I get the sense that the Ukrainian defenses around Avdeyevka are buckling and breaking down faster than they did in Bakhmut, and that I've even seen one report from a Ukrainian source which guesstimated that Avdeyevka might fall in about a week's time. Now, I don't know whether that is true, and I don't know how reliable the commentator who says that is. Earlier Russian reports that I've seen assumed that the battle for Avdeyevka would be prolonged, would take several weeks or even months, if it is indeed the case that Avdeyevka is going to fall within, well, maybe let's say not 1 week, but let's say 1 month, then in that case one can say definitely that Ukraine's military position is now becoming not just critical, but even desperate, and we might indeed be looking maybe not at the beginning of the end of the war, but at a tipping point in it where Ukraine starts to move towards some kind of progressive military collapse. Anyway, we will see. There has been fighting in other places. I talked about the attacks on Kupiansk. There was a big Russian push towards Vuhledar. And again, we're getting all kinds of conflicting reports about this. The Daily Telegraph, rather like happened with the early news about the fighting near Avdeyevka, made all kinds of claims about how I think it was 10 Russian tanks were all destroyed in the advance towards Vuhledar. Other Russian reports basically ignore all of that. But there was apparently a Russian push towards Vuhledar. I'm going to suggest that these Russian advances in Vuhledar, and apparently in Marinka as well, apparently the Russians have captured a whole new sector of what is left of Marinka. I'm going to suggest that they should all be understood within the context of the Battle of Avdeyevka. If you look at a map, Avdeyevka, Marinka, and Vuhledar all seem to be connected to each other. They're all Avdeyevka is in the north, but it sort of brings together all the various places in southern and central Donetsk region. What the Russians are now doing is that they're putting pressure on the Ukrainian forces throughout this area, moving to crumble them. And what will probably happen is that if Avdeyevka falls, we will see Marinka and Vuhledar fall in quick succession. After all, that was what Michael Clark in the Sunday Times was also basically saying a week ago. So, anyway, that's the fighting there. So, an operational crisis for Ukraine in southern Donetsk, an operational crisis for Ukraine around Kupiansk. Apparently, lots of things happening in Kupiansk. Earlier in the fighting around there, I mentioned the fact that if one tracked what the Russian Ministry of Defense was saying, fighting around Kupiansk was not actually that intense. That is no longer the case anymore. Based on the information the Russian Ministry of Defense is giving, Ukrainian losses around Kupiansk are now spiking. The Russian Defense Ministry speaks about 250, sometimes more men being killed around there a day. Killed or wounded, I should say, around there a day. That is a battalion worth of troops being destroyed over a 2-day period around Kupiansk. So, very intense fighting there as well. And in the meantime, the Russians continue their drone offensive across Ukraine. More drones, more missile strikes. Apparently, for the first time in several weeks, KH-101 cruise missiles were used in an attack last night. Not apparently in huge numbers, but the Russians continue to launch drone and missile attacks. And what must be concerning for Ukraine and alarming to Ukraine's Western sponsors is that the Russians do seem for the moment to have got on top of Ukraine's own missile and drone attacks. We hear lots of reports of Ukraine trying to send more drones to attack Crimea and other Russian positions on the southern front lines. There was a big drone attack yesterday, for example, and a big missile attack yesterday. And the Russians seem to be succeeding in intercepting or bringing down all of these drones and all of these missiles, including ATACMS missiles from time to time, but Storm Shadows as well. And sometimes they're shot down, including there's been apparently one verifiable case where a MiG-31 fighter jet did in fact shoot down a Ukrainian cruise missile. But apparently electronic warfare systems are increasingly successful in interfering with the operations of Ukrainian drones and are making it more and more difficult for those drones to operate. So, a steadily deteriorating picture for Ukraine. Now, I'm going to just touch on two very important articles about the conflict in Ukraine that have appeared. One is by Scott Ritter, in which he has, first commentator I've seen on the Western side, who has spoken about the huge state of the military build-up that is going on in Russia, the enormous expansion of the Russian military, the vast numbers of machines and equipment that are being produced. This is an article that appears in Consortium News, by the way, and Scott Ritter says this isn't just to win the war in Ukraine, it is also intended for the long term, and I'm sure he's right about that. But in some ways, even more interesting is an article that has appeared on Dancing with Bears by John Helmer. And the reason for this article is an opinion poll in Russia carried out by the Levada polling agency, which, by the way, is run by liberal opponents of President Putin's and which the Russian government has labeled a foreign agent. Anyway, as John Helmer points out, the opinion poll shows solid support for President Putin, solid support for the Russian military, ultimate confidence on the part of the Russian people in victory. And that is all true and correct. But Helmer also makes two other very interesting points. The first is that the opinion poll discusses whether most people in Russia would support negotiations to end the war. And the opinion poll shows that they would, but this is of course unsurprising because President Putin himself always says that Russia is prepared to sit down and negotiate. Public opinion here is simply echoing the official position of the Russian government. But, as Helmer points out, when it is suggested that Russia seek a negotiated solution to the war that involves return of territory that the Russians say is now part of their country, say Zaporozhye and Kherson region, at that point, support for a negotiated solution falls drastically. And Putin himself, who must be getting a lot more detailed private polling data than this, cannot be unaware of that. There's been a lot of talk about the Russians being willing to engage Ukraine in negotiations. And of course, they always say that. The Russian Defense Minister Shoigu said it again whilst he was in Beijing on a recent visit recently. But when it comes to making substantive concessions to Ukraine, even the Russian public is not at all keen on that idea. And I have to say that I think the Russian military and political leadership are united against it. And they're not only united against it, not only the military and political leadership, there's clear signs now that the business community is becoming more united behind the Kremlin than they have been in the past. One of the most bizarre, in some ways I found it almost preposterous episodes of this conflict has been tracking the activities of two important Russian oligarchs. They work together. These are Mr. Friedman and Mr. Arven, who are the co-founders and operators of Alpha Bank, one of the few big private banks still left in Russia. And these are big league oligarchs. They were big league oligarchs in the Yeltsin era. Arven, for a time, was even a minister in the Russian government during the Yeltsin era. Anyway, Arven and Friedman have invested heavily in the West, including in Britain. Friedman has been based in Britain for some time. Arven has been based in Latvia. And despite their long history of criticism and skepticism of President Putin, they now find themselves as Russian businessmen coming under increasing pressure. And they've seen their property and their businesses seized in the West. And Friedman made a dash to Israel. Arven is now under pressure in Latvia. And Friedman is apparently deciding to return to Russia. And apparently so is Arven. And Friedman has made some extraordinary statements about what a mistake it was for him to invest in the West, in Britain specifically. He speaks of himself as being almost an idiot for having gone down that path. And I think he speaks for quite a few people within the Russian business community. There are no doubt some Russian businessmen, some Russian oligarchs, who still hanker for some kind of reconciliation with the West. But I suspect that what Friedman and Arven are saying is probably more representative of how many of them feel. And if the sanctions have achieved anything, it is, it seems to me, a further consolidation of the Russian political system behind the Kremlin. And Putin, who does have a sense of humor, must be laughing to himself at the results. Going back to that opinion poll that Helmer was talking about, here I might be slightly wrong. I'm not going to pretend that I've been able to analyze its results precisely. But I got the clear sense from reading it, and here, as I said, I may be wrong, that in fact, on the issue of the war, Moscow has now become more hardline in the feeling in Moscow has become more hardline about the war than is true generally across Russia. That whereas there would be some willingness to engage in negotiations if the Kremlin decided on them across Russia, there is more opposition to that in Moscow. Now this, if I'm right in this, and I'm not sure I am, then if I am right in this, that would be a remarkable turnaround, given that Moscow has been, by far, Russia's most liberal city. That would be a direct product of the sanctions and of the kind of things that people like Arven and Friedman have experienced. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are with this crisis in Ukraine. Things beginning to become very difficult indeed. Very difficult conflict for Ukraine. as I said, still no clear idea from anybody in the West about how to bring it to an end. This is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also, if you wish, support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.